Oh no! It sounds very much like a fire alarm.
Okay, welcome everyone. It's a very special morning in which 8 undergraduate students will tell you a little more about the research they've been doing over the summer. We have several people being Skyped in from the west coast of the US, so if some of us are talking to computers, don't think that we lost it. So if you're interested in research on bilingualism and you live in central Pennsylvania, what do? You go elsewhere. And that's exactly what these students have been doing. So each of the students who will speak about his research in a minute has been trained for at least 2 semesters in our labs. And they were then awarded with a competitive NSF Pire award that allowed them to go elsewhere to conduct the study they've been designed themselves. So this is basically a sketch of how the international collaboration works. On the left-hand side is the US, and these students went to places in Europe as well as in China. So if you're interested in bilingualism, of course, in central Pennsylvania, we have bilinguals and second language learners as well, but you really want to take advantage of the international community that's interested in bilingualism. So within the Center for Language Science at Penn State, we have developed many collaborations with very renowned researchers all over the world. And we let our students take advantage of these research collaborations. So this has been helped and funded by a 5-year-long NSF Pire mechanism that is entitled Bilingualism Mind and Brain. It's a discipline program in cognitive psychology, linguistics, and cognitive neuroscience. So it's both international and it's interdisciplinary. So the students from many different departments and programs within Penn State can benefit from this mechanism. And our international partners are Radboud University in Nijmegen, Mannheim University in Germany, Lund University in Lund, University of Granada in Spain, a university in Tarragona, the Research Center for Bilingualism in Bangor, Beijing Normal University in China, and University of Hong Kong in China. So students have the ability to conduct their research in one of these international sites. And then we also have 2 domestic partners, Haskins Labs, and the Center for the NSF Science Learning Center at Delaware University. So this is how our international research network looks like. So the yellow parts are people within Penn State, and then we reach out to different continents and to different countries. The students who did research abroad all maintained a blog, and if you want to know more about their secret lives and the experiences that they gained and the cultural immersion they experienced, I strongly recommend visiting the blogs. It's just wonderful to read how being abroad for the summer, being immersed in a research lab elsewhere, and taking advantage of all the cultural experiences that the place has to offer, is really benefiting these students, and it really moves them to the next level, which in many cases is actually graduate school. Pire program consists of 3 different parts. There's an undergraduate program, which you'll hear more about in a minute. But we also have a program for graduate students, so graduate students can also go abroad, do research abroad for an entire semester. And then we have a mechanism in place for postdoctoral and early career faculty. The basic goal is to train a new cohort of researchers on language science and the science of bilingualism. So today we have 8 students who are presenting their work today. So because we have 8 students and only so much time, I would like to ask to keep your questions until the very end. This way we can make sure that each of the students will have the opportunity to present his or her work. So we'll start out with a research project that has been conducted in the University of Granada, and it's a dual presentation by Daniel Blackwood and Lily Massimo.
Hi, my name is Brittany Massimino, and this is Dan Bloodgood, and today Dan and I are going to be presenting together. Dan and I share similar research questions and also have been testing the same type of participants. So our Pire partner was the Memory and Language Research Lab at the University of Granada in Granada, Spain, and the title of our talk today is Using the Native Language at Home and Abroad. Does the native language suffer when learners are immersed in a second language?
I'm going to talk without a microphone. Did everyone hear me okay? Okay. So we've all seen these glitzy pictures of study abroad and the rich cultural experiences students get when they choose to study abroad. Oftentimes, one of the main reasons they choose to do so is to increase proficiency in a second language. But yet, little research has been done about why second language learning abroad is so effective. Here, we decided to study how immersion in second language can increase proficiency based on the well-known ideas about bilingualism and second language learning. So at the Center for Language Science, a lot of us study how bilinguals manage knowledge of multiple languages. It's been found that both languages are always active in the brain, and that bilinguals must inhibit alternatives in one language in order to speak the alternative in the other language. Although this may seem to come at a cognitive cost, bilinguals have actually been found to outperform monolinguals on tests of executive function. What's surprising is that while we may consider bilinguals as people who are perfectly proficient in both languages, in reality there's a wide variety of people who can be considered bilingual. Notably, people are actually much more sensitive to a second language later in life than previously thought. In the Osterhout et al. Study, they conducted a study with French learners during their first semester of college, in which they had them guess on word and non-word recognition in French. What they found was ERP measures were sensitive to word, non-word recognition after just a couple of days of second language learning. Given that we're testing immersed learners, we're expecting to find even more dramatic effects.
So one of the main studies that has looked at immersed learners compared to classroom learners who are learning a second language is the Link et al. 2009 study. So this study found that people who were immersed produced more Spanish words. However, their English was fewer than the classroom learners. And upon retest of these same immersed learners, they found that the Spanish proficiency stayed the same. However, their English was able to return to the normal levels. So in this current study, Dan and I are testing 5 different groups of people. The main group that we're going to be talking about today is the immersed, or what we consider our immersed students. So we have a pre-abroad group. So these are all intermediate classroom learners who plan on studying abroad in either a spring or a summer abroad program. And then we have our abroad program, our abroad group, who are the participants that we tested while we were in Granada, Spain, and they're further divided depending on their length of immersion. So we have summer semester, a 1 semester, and 2 semesters. And then we also have the post-abroad group, which are people who have just recently returned from a study abroad experience, either a spring or a summer program. And then we have our controls as well, who are the classroom learners and monolinguals, and testing is still ongoing for that. So for our study tasks, we have a variety of language fluency tasks. So we have a lexical decision, which looks at the comprehension in both English and Spanish, a verbal fluency task, which looked at the production in both English and Spanish, a homograph task, and also a Delhi grammar task.
Okay, so since we knew we wouldn't be testing the same people in each of these phases of the study, we chose a number of cognitive measures that allow us to compare participants on the same standards. OSPAN, ACPT, and Simon can be used to measure individual differences in cognitive resources, and we'd also be looking at how this affects second language proficiency. We also included an ERP picture naming task, which would allow us to examine the millisecond to millisecond neural basis of planning in the first and second language. So today we're just going to present on the 3 phases of the study where we have collected a significant amount of data. Notably, we've got a full set of data from abroad with people immersed in Granada, Spain, and we're still actively testing people for the pre-abroad and post-abroad conditions. So far, we've been finding that people are generally matched in terms of age, grammar knowledge, working memory, and also second language proficiency.
Okay, so the research questions that I was interested in asking was how does second language learning affect the underlying semantic networks, as well as what effects does immersion have on the production of the native language? So in order to answer these questions, one of the tasks that the participants performed was a homograph task. And in this task, the participants would see 2 English words, and they had to decide if these word pairs were semantically related or not. So something that would be semantically related would be like apple and orange. However, apple and chair would be considered not semantically related. So also in this task, there were some trials that contained an English-Spanish homograph. Just a review of homographs. Homographs are words that share a similar lexical form, however, they differ in meaning. So an example of a homograph trial that a participant might see in this task would be the word pair of pie, toe. So when we ask, is this pie, toe semantically related to English, the answer would be no. However, the word pie, or pie in Spanish, means foot, so foot and toe would be semantically related. So we would expect that people who know Spanish would have greater interference and would then take longer to respond to this task. What we found was that the immersed learners showed a significant sensitivity to the L2 meaning of the homograph trial compared to the control trial, whereas the pre-abroad learners did not show any sensitivity at all. We also found that overall, the immersed learners were significantly slower when it came to responding in this task because it was in English, whereas the pre-abroad learners were quicker because they were not in their immersed environment and just in the L1. So another task that we looked at was a verbal fluency task. So in this task, participants would see a particular semantic category, and they had to respond. They had 30 seconds to respond, so they'd see something like the semantic category fruits, and they'd say apples, oranges, strawberries, peaches. This task was first performed in English and then later in Spanish, and the material were counterbalanced so that the participants did not see the same categories in Spanish that they had previously seen in English. What we found was that we were able to replicate the Link et al. Paper or study, which found that the immersed learners were producing fewer English exemplars than the classroom learners, but also producing more Spanish exemplars than the classroom learners. So we can see here that the L1 was being inhibited when these immersed learners were producing English. So we kind of wanted to take a look more and see what could be happening to this L1 inhibition for the abroad group. So we further broke down the group into 3 different categories based on their length of immersion. So we have a summer only, a 1 semester, and 2 semesters. So what we found by looking at this is that the people who were immersed for a shorter period of time were actually had to inhibit their L1 more than the people who had been abroad for longer periods of time, thinking that maybe this might be something to do with people who are abroad for a longer period of time are able to balance their L1 and L2 better than those people who are just arriving into the immersed environment. And then we also found that the length of immersion was related to proficiency in the L2. So people who were immersed for longer periods of time were able to produce in Spanish.
Okay, so now I'm going to talk about a series of related questions to Brittany's experiment. Like I mentioned earlier, we're interested in whether language learners use the same cognitive mechanisms to use multiple languages as do bilinguals. We're also interested in how the immersion experience affects both the native language and the second language, and how the native language recovers after returning. So to review this, we'll first start with the Mizra et al. Study, which was done with Chinese English bilinguals here in State College. So these participants were asked to name pictures in the same blocks in different blocks between English and Spanish, English and Chinese. And so you can see here, half the group either named in English first, and the other half would name in Chinese first, whereas the other one then named L1 and then L2. If there's no inhibition pressure, then we would expect facilitation between blocks. However, if they had to inhibit their native language to speak the second language, then it should be a little slower and require more effort to speak it. That's exactly what they found in the ERP record over here on the left, is greater negativity in the N2 component. In ERP waveforms, negativity is plotted up and generally is associated with more effort to speak something. In the current design, we're looking at then how English recovers after being spoken in L2. So for our study, half the persons would name all in English, and the other half would engage in English, Spanish, English mixed block. And so in our study, we also counterbalance pictures that things named in block 2 would be half new and half old, whereas things in block 3 would be half old from block 1 and half old from block 2. So for those in mixed language condition, block 3 then is half old from L1 and half old from L2. What we found was clear effects of priming in the English room condition. Obviously, it makes sense that people are faster to name things in block 3 when they've already seen everything in block 1. However, in the mixed language condition, an intervening block of Spanish erases these effects. On average, participants are about the same or even a little bit slower to name in block 3, even though they've already seen all these pictures. When we break it up on whether things are old from block 1 or old from block 2, the inhibitory effects become even more apparent. So for the people in the mixed language condition, they're slow to name things that were named in block 2 because they're previously named in Spanish, yet they're faster to name things in block 1, even though they're less recent since they're named in L1. When we compare this to people from the English-only condition, they're faster to name things from block 2 since they were named more recently, and shows the effects of priming. This dissociation between the two conditions shows that inhibition is in fact at work in these language forms. So now to answer our overarching question of does immersion increase L2 proficiency? And our preliminary answer so far is yes. People are faster to name abroad than they are in either the pre or the post conditions. And while they eventually do become slower in the post-abroad condition, they're still faster than they were as their pre-abroad selves. Our data is still being collected and our testing is ongoing, so we can't call these results final. But generally, we are finding a positive and lasting effect in studying abroad.
Okay, so we would just like to acknowledge the NSF Pire grant and the NIH grant, and as well our advisor, Judith Kroll, who has helped us from the beginning working on this Pire research, and also Teresa Bacco, who was our advisor while we were in Granada, Mari Cruz, who has been really helpful in figuring out everything abroad, and also Eleanor Rossi, who for her thoughtful contributions.
Also, all these people who are listed above who help with everything from the random subjects through the designing of scripts to the coding of data. And in particular, we'd like to thank Kinsey Bice and Ron McLean for the two graduate students who are doing research on second language learners, and their projects have been a guiding influence for us throughout this endeavor.
Okay, so adios, Granada, or as they would say in Granada,
Adio.
Halloran, who also went to the University of Granada in Spain.
Hi, my name is Kelsey Halloran. I was also in Granada, Spain, and my study was on L2 acquisition of S-lenition and vowel waxing. So, a little linguistic background. There are many varieties of Spanish S-lenition, and it's been seen in Caribbean, Chile, Argentinian, and southern Spain. The phonological process that's been described is either producing the S, limiting it, or aspirating. And it can affect plural markers and also non-morphological markers. So in Granada, not only do they limit the S or omit it, or aspirate, they also have vowel waxing. And I'm going to play 3 audios for you. This is a person who's from Granada, and listen to see if you can hear the difference between completely saying the word, saying it in a plural form, and omitting it, or aspirating.
El gato negro. Los gatos negros.
And then this is the aspirating form.
Los gatos negros.
So as you can see, there's not it's hard to tell if you're not particularly from there, but there's definitely aspirating instead of saying the plural form. And this is all 3 of them together.
Gato, gatos, gato.
Okay. So those are the 3 different types of ways they pronounce. They will either, when talking in a plural form, they'll either say the S when it's in more of a formal setting, and when it's not, they have a tendency to aspirate. So a little explanation of F1 and F2. If you're not familiar with it, F1 correlates with the lowering or rising of a vowel, and F2 correlates with fronting or backing of a vowel. So how can we measure this? I followed Corrigan's 2006 thesis when doing my experiment, and what she had done was she measured the F1 and F2 in a single woman from Granada. She had only been living in the US for 3 months, and although she's aware of the characteristics, she didn't know that that's what this experiment was testing for. So when there's laxing in the vowels, you'll see that the F1 will be substantially higher than the F1 in the singular. Sorry, the F1 in the plural will be higher than the F1 in the singular. And as you can see, it happens for all of them except for egg. So why is this important? Giesland et al. 2013 had examined acquisition of the present perfect, like I comido, versus the preterite, comi, by L2 speakers living in Spain. The speakers were only there for 7 weeks, which is important because it's a short amount of time. And she had found that the speakers used more present tense as they became more proficient in their L2. And this also indicates that students can acquire dialectal variation in study abroad situations. So my research question was, will they acquire the S-lenition and will they acquire vowel waxing when studying abroad? I had 23 adult L2 participant speakers, 10 were male, 13 were female, and then 10 adult L1 Spanish speakers, 5 male, 5 female, for a control. I then divided the L2 group into 3 different groups depending on their immersion. We have a high immersion group who had been there for 5 months or more, middle who had been there for exactly 5 months, and low who were there for less than 5 months. We then had, our methods were all comparing singular and plural forms. So we had a picture description task, a noun plus adjective naming task, Berko naming task, and a reading list. The picture naming task, what was important was getting the singular and the plural form, and then comparing them. So what they would say is, aquí hay un barco nuevo, and then they would see the next picture and say, aquí hay un barco viejo. And then they would say the same again for the plural. A reading task, which was also comparing singular and plural forms. And then the Berko lug task. This was named by Jean Berko, who had originally tested it on an English student in 1958. It was on children, for plurals. And they would see a singular form, and then they would see 2, and they'd have to state the plural. and also a novel word. And this is an example of the novel.
Este es un toco para hay dos tocos.
So here again, we would, I segmented this out, comparing the F1 and the F2 of the singular and plural. For my preliminary data, we have the immersion, the high, middle, low, and then comparing the F1 singular to the F1 plural, comparing the F2 singular to the F2 plural. What we can see is that I have replicated her findings, and in the high and middle groups who had been there for 5 months or more, their F1 in the plural was higher than their F1 in the singular, which shows that laxing does occur. And in the low group who had been there for less than 5 months, shows that it doesn't occur. So proficiency level, or the length of immersion, is important. Another part of laxing is that in comparing F2s, the F2 in the plural should be lower than the F2 in the singular, but in this case we hadn't found it. Yeah. But Corbin also didn't find this, so I'm not too worried. Our future questions are, why are the LT speakers not knitting in our task? Would they unite more in spontaneous speech? Is it an issue of formality? And is this sort of phonological variation more difficult to acquire than the variation that Giesland found? And a special thanks to Pire, Dr. Karen Miller, Teresa Bajo, the entire Pire team, Alvaro, Manola, and Caitlin McCoskey.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Maggie Lam, and I spent my summer abroad at the University of Hong Kong. The title of my project is Processing-Based Assessment of Language and Its Relation to Theory of Mind in Preschoolers. So what is theory of mind and executive function? Theory of mind is the understanding of another person's mental state. This can be thoughts, beliefs, desires. Executive function is related to theory of mind and defines cognitive processes such as inhibition and working memory. For a little background information, our lab has conducted research with English monolinguals and Mandarin monolinguals. There's literature that suggests that both executive function and language are related to the theory of mind. There has been some bilingual research in the theory of mind showing that bilinguals score better in some of the theory of mind tasks and not as well in others, so more research is needed. At this point, there has not been any research with Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals. So I wanted to know, do Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals perform better than the Mandarin and English monolinguals in theory of mind and executive function? And I wanted to know what the relationship is between theory of mind, executive function, language processing, and language knowledge. I predicted that the Mandarin Cantonese bilinguals would perform better in theory of mind compared to the English and Mandarin monolingual groups. My participants, the ages were an average of 5.8 years old. This was a little higher than we expected. We were recruiting for 3 to 5-year-olds. We had 9 boys and 9 girls. 9 of the children's first language was Mandarin, and the other 9's first language was Cantonese. I did this based on a parent questionnaire where the parents ranked their children, but if I had done it solely on age of acquisition, then more of these children's L1 would have been Mandarin language, and all of these children learn English in preschool. The parent questionnaire, again, it provided just a lot of information about the child's first, second, and third, and sometimes fourth language acquisition, and the parents ranked their proficiency. So for my methods, the theory of mind tasks, we had 6 tasks, and they each increased in difficulty. One example is diverse desires. The child is given a situation, and if the child chooses opposite of their own personal desire, then they are scored correct, and so on and so forth. Executive function tests for inhibition. So here for working memory, we see if the child can count and label the object together. So for example, 1 is a cow, 2 is a boat, 3 is a train. For peg tapping, the child is given 2 rules. When I tap once, you tap twice, and vice versa. For knowledge-based language measures, we tested for both vocabulary and grammar. For vocabulary, we used a picture naming task in both Cantonese and Mandarin, and we did this just to make sure the child was bilingual and familiar with both languages. But for the grammar, we tested in Mandarin only. Processing-based language measures makes our study unique, and we used fast mapping and syntactic bootstrapping, which both involve a novel word, novel noun for fast mapping, and novel verb for syntactic bootstrapping. Here's an example, the picture on the right, where we say to the child, show me the DAX, and can the child label the novel object with the novel noun. So for my data, everything we converted into percents just for the easiness of understanding, but the self and the picture naming tasks are both raw scores. The English kids with self did exceptionally well, and the Cantonese picture naming, all but 2 of the children scored within norms. So for the rest of the language knowledge, we have them in percents. For Mandarin picture naming, both of the scored kids did well. The Mandarin children may have done better because of regional differences. And the grammar skills, the kids both did the same. So showing that our bilingual group is proficient in Mandarin. For language processing, our bilingual group did the worst in both of the tasks. And that may be because the non-words that we had from Beijing for the Mandarin-speaking kids weren't truly non-words. They may have been suggestive of the shape or the object's shape or what the object is used for. And for syntactic bootstrapping, the non-word previously may have been suggestive of some type of action. So in Hong Kong, when I got there, we changed those non-words to make them truly novel. For working memory, our Mandarin group, again, did the best, but our bilingual group was a close second, and still very well. That's a pretty good score, which may suggest some enhanced executive function. And again, the bilingual group did very great in this peg tapping task, and it might show an enhanced executive function again. So for theory of mind, the bilingual group did the best, which I had predicted in my hypothesis, and this may be, again, due to enhanced executive function, but I can't say that with certainty. So what's next? I want to analyze the relationships among all of the tasks and see what kind of role executive function, language processing, and language knowledge play in the development of theory of mind. It's good. Well, here's some pictures from my wonderful cultural experience. And I would like to thank Dr. Miller for You've taught me so much, and Carol Toe was my advisor abroad. Gary, Carmen, and Allie helped me and administered all the tests while I was there, and I'd like to thank the entire Pire team for this wonderful learning opportunity.
So the next speaker is Suzuki Moriyasu, who went to Japan.
So hi, my name is Mizuki Moriyasu, and I looked at how immersion can affect the first language in bilinguals in the US and in Japan. So my research was really similar to Dan and Brittany's research, except I was looking at bilinguals in Japan instead of in Spain. And so again, when studying how immersion affects proficiency, a lot of times people have researched how it affects the second language, but not much the first language. So as they explained before, Link et al. 2009 actually found that they can have costs to the first language when immersed. So the present study looked at how this immersion affects the second language and the first language in Japanese English bilinguals, so their native language is Japanese, in both Japan and the US. So first we looked at how it affects their proficiency using two measures. We used a subjective rating, which is their own ratings of their language proficiency, and an objective verbal fluency, which is the same thing that they used. So interestingly, as you can see in this chart, when they rated themselves from 1 to 7 on reading, writing, speaking, and listening, the US immersed participants rated themselves higher in both their L1 and their L2. And we kind of think this might be because they have less Japanese speakers here at Penn State to compare themselves with, and so they naturally just think themselves kind of higher in that measure. But interestingly, on the objective performance and the verbal fluency, the number of exemplars that they could give on average was hardly different from the Japanese group. So I had 27 participants at Penn State who were all native Japanese speakers. Some of them did speak a third language, but they all spoke Japanese first and then English. And then I had 35 participants at the Kobe City University of Foreign Studies. And as you can see, they're basically balanced by age, but the PSU group had significantly higher experience abroad. So we looked at picture naming for this study, and we measured both the speed and the accuracy of their responses. We based this design off of the Guo et al. 2011 study, where half the participants had to name in only their first language first, and then another block of their second language, and then mixed. And the other half had to name the opposite, so their second language first, then their first language, and then mixed. In the mixed block, they were cued as to what language to name in by the color of the frame that was around the picture. So here, there's a blue frame around the picture, which means name in English. And both kinds of switching have been found in previous research to have a cost in the first language when naming first language after second. So we wanted to look at how this affects immersed bilinguals. And we found that the US group on the right, when naming the second language after the first language, actually were slower to name in their first language than their second language, even though they were all first language dominant. And also there was an effect on naming in the second language before the first language for the Japan group as well. So clearly, even though these people are much better and much more proficient at speaking in their first language, that advantage can be lost momentarily. Also, when comparing the blocked versus the mixed blocks, there is also significant increase in reaction time for both the Japan group and the US group. So in conclusion, even the highly L1 dominant groups can momentarily lose their first language advantage when naming in the first language after naming an extended period of time in their second language. And bilinguals who are immersed can actually even go as far as speaking even slower in their first language than in their second language. And finally, this is just a picture of me with Dr. Hoshino's seminar group, and they were really helpful in this whole experience. And I'd like to thank Dr. Kroll, Dr. Hoshino, and the Center of Language Sciences and the Summer Research Discovery Grant, which I went under.
The next speaker is Pia Papas, who went to Humboldt University in Berlin.
Hi, my name is Leah Pappas, and I worked with Carrie Jackson and Jeanette Van Hel here in State College and on my Pire project. And this summer I went to Berlin, Germany, and worked with Dr. Katharina Spelak at Humboldt University on my project titled The Acquisition of L2 Gender in German, French, and English-French Bilinguals. So before I talk about anything else, I want to talk a little bit about grammar. I'm sure, or not grammar, gender. I'm sure most of you have experience trying to learn a second language with gender, and you found that it's very difficult because gender is completely arbitrary. So in these examples here, I have French, which is, for the dog in French, is le chien, which is masculine. But turtle is feminine, la tortue. But car, which has two words that describes the same object, but it could be masculine or feminine depending on which word you want to use. La voiture is feminine and l'auto is masculine. However, across languages, this also isn't even the same. In German, car is das Auto, which is neuter. So it's very complicated, and therefore has been a hot topic in recent literature. A lot of studies have been looking at gender acquisition in your second language. And a lot of them have found that there is native language influence when speaking in your second language. These studies have found that reaction times or production times are faster in your second language whenever gender is the same in your first language as it is in your second language. And they found that they're slower in their second language when gender is opposite. So if the gender in your native language, German, is masculine and it's feminine in French, then you'll have a slower production time. But a lot of these studies have been focusing on languages that have very similar gender systems, such as French and Spanish, for example, which both have only masculine and feminine, or they're going from a language with a gender system that has less gender than the second language, such as going a native language in French, which has 2, and going into German as the second language, which has 3. So my advisors and I were interested in looking at native speakers of German, which has 3 genders, who are learning French, which has 2. And these are 2 very different gender systems. So today I'm going to be solely focusing on my first research question: does the L1 influence L2 production, notably when an aspect of the L1 grammar does not exist in the L2? So this is considering the neuter condition in German. French does not have neuter gender, and so we're curious to see how German speakers treat French words when the gender is neuter in German. So we put together a study, and while I was in Berlin, I recruited 34 German-French upper-level bilinguals learning French in Berlin, in or around Berlin, Germany. And they did a very simple task. There were 3 picture naming tasks. The first one was a bare noun task, so they saw a picture on the screen and they named just the noun. The second task, using exactly the same pictures, was a determiner noun task. So they said the determiner, le or la, and the noun. And the final picture naming task was of the picture. So they said that it was big or small. And we matched stimuli, 20 stimuli, over 3 conditions. So we had 60 stimuli altogether. So our first condition was the congruent gender, which were words that had the same gender in both French and German. So in this case, la fleur and die Blume are both feminine. The incongruent gender had opposite gender. So if it was masculine in German, it was feminine in French, and vice versa. And our final condition was the no gender match condition, and these were the words that were neuter in German and either masculine or feminine in French. So returning to my research question, our results can say that yes, there is L1 influence in L2 production. So as you can see, our results were in line with previous studies. With the accuracy, participants were much less accurate in the incongruent condition than they were in the congruent and the no gender match conditions. And our reaction time data is in line with our accuracy data, and they were much longer in the incongruent condition. Reaction times were much longer in the incongruent condition than in the congruent and the no gender match condition. And so this is suggesting, as other studies have done before, that there is an inhibitory effect in the incongruent condition. So the first language is inhibiting production in the second language. There is a facilitatory effect in the congruent condition because reaction times are much slower. And the no gender match condition, although not quite as fast as the congruent, it was also significant according to the incongruent condition. However, since they were not quite as fast, it's somewhere in the middle. And so we are interested in answering my second research question, which compares these neuter condition results with my English-French bilinguals that I am testing this fall. And so this fall, I hope to answer this question and compare the neuter results with the English-French bilinguals. And I also hope to answer my third question, which is it possible to acquire native-like proficiency in the L2 with an aspect of grammar that doesn't exist in the L1? So this refers to the fact that in English we don't have gender. We don't have gender, and so can English speakers use gender like a native speaker at an advanced level? So this semester I hope to finish collecting my English-French data. My advisors and I also hope to do some more analyses and split participant data according to French gender in the no gender match condition. And this is to assure that whenever the gender was neuter in German, that the German speakers weren't just defaulting to French or to masculine gender in French, for example. And we also hope to code the bare noun task because this was used as a baseline to get the participants used to the study and also just to see their proficiency in general. So I want to thank all of these people for keeping me on track and sending me on this wonderful adventure, and here's some pictures.
Thank you. The next speaker is Kelly Wittmans, who went to Radboud Universiteit Nijmegen.
So my name is Taylor, and I did my Pire research in the Netherlands, looking at notionality and grammatical gender, and how L1 notionality and grammatical gender could potentially influence L2 sentence production. So just a brief definition before I get started. Notionality or notional number is basically how a person can conceptualize two items in a noun phrase. So say you have the bread and the butter. You have these two separate nouns, but depending on how you might view them, like you could either see them as being one entity, like the bread and the butter, or you could see them as being two separate things, the bread and the butter. And then that also could influence how you produce your sentence, saying like the bread and the butter is on the table versus like the bread and butter are on the table. And then you also have different items like the phone and the notebook, which are more notionally plural, and they would be less likely to take, say, like the phone and the notebook is on the table. So my study is based off of two studies. The first is Laura Mordell, 2012, which found evidence of grammatical gender and notionality on subject-verb agreement in L1 Dutch speakers. So they found that items of similar gender in Dutch elicited more singular subject-verb agreement after noun phrase, and more notionally singular items also had the same effect. And then Hatzidaki et al. 2011 found that syntactic features from an L1 can be activated and surface in L2 production where there are incongruent features. So, for example, in English you have like the money is on the table, the money is singular. But in Greek you have talefta to trapezi, talefta is plural. So in code switch phrases with bilinguals, you have the bilinguals are supposed to be speaking the target language, which technically would take singular agreement if you're speaking English. But these, the number from the first language is influencing production in the second language. So my study looked at Dutch-English bilinguals and how we could potentially see these effects in their production of English, their L2. So will we find L1 notional effects of conjoined noun phrases during L2 production? And will we find an effect of determiner noun agreement from an L1 with grammatical gender marked on the determiners in an L2 with grammatical gender that's not marked on the determiners? So since this is kind of an abstract concept, I kind of made a little flowchart of how this could possibly happen. So when a person's speaking a language, you have these lemmas that are activated for the nouns. And then the corresponding gender and number nodes are also activated as well. So then on a semantic level, then you have this the notionality idea where the noun phrase could take either singular or plural agreement based on their notional concepts, how they're conceptualized. And then also on the syntactic level, they could either coalesce into a more singular entity versus two separate ones based on whether they have same or different determiners. So my participants that I tested 50 Dutch-English bilinguals in the Netherlands, and I'm currently testing 30 English monolinguals as a control group here in State College. In addition to a general O-span and Boston naming task, my experimental task was a production task. So I had two conditions. 30 of my participants received a condition where it was mixed blocks, so they would have like one sentence they would receive in English and then one in Dutch, and they would kind of be randomized throughout. 20 of them received a block condition, so they would receive one block in English, one block in Dutch, and then it was kind of balanced for other participants. So they would hear pre-recorded preamble, so something like the bread and the butter, and they would repeat what they heard and then provide a location for it, so like the bread and the butter are on the table. We manipulated the items by gender, so we have items of different genders, the top two up there. And then we have items of the same gender, so these. And some of the participants would hear the items in Dutch, and some of them would hear them in English. And we also manipulated for notionality, so we have more notionally singular items like the bread and the butter, and less notionally singular items like the pen and the book. And again, some participants received it in Dutch and some in English. So our preliminary findings so far, this analysis just includes the mixed condition so far, and it also just factors in English notionality ratings. We're going to be factoring in Dutch notionality later. But you see that the less notionally singular items did take less singular subject-verb agreement, and the more notionally singular items did generally take more singular subject-verb agreement. But the gender effects we didn't really see so much in the less notionally singular, but when we get to the more notionally singular, we do see some gender effects. So, in summary, The results so far kind of indicate that L2 notionality can influence production in the L2, particularly with more notionally singular items. So you can take more singular agreement, and then also we do see some gender effects in more notionally singular noun phrases. Again, with the same gender taking more singular agreement. So what is the big deal of all this? Well, if we're looking at the collectivization theory of bilingualism, a lot of studies have kind of indicated that the lexicon is collectivated. And then Hasadaki also showed that during code switching, there are grammatical features that are co-activated during production. Well, we're also kind of seeing here that grammatical features can be activated during L2 production from the L1. So, future plans, I'm going to add in the Dutch notionality ratings to see how the Dutch and English compare. Analyze the blocked condition and also finish running my monolingual control group. And thank you to my advisors, my Pire partner, Pire CLS, and Sarah, Caitlin, and Caitlin for all their help with ECAD, because that's awful.
Hello everybody. As Dr. Bentham just said, my name is Ben Stewart and my Pire advisor is Professor Julie Lucias, and I will be presenting today on the constraints of the comprehension of code switches, testing individuals who code switch and those who do not. Now, first we need to ask ourselves, what is code switching? Spanish-English bilingual communities living in the United States exhibit this behavior that is known as code switching, which refers to the ability of a speaker to alternate frequently between the two languages. Code switching occurs most often during speech production, but it also has been seen to occur in written text ranging from everything from chats to emails to even literature. I provided an example here. As you can see, the bold text represents a part of the sentence, "El profesor dijo que," students studied for the exam. And then you can see at the point of the Spanish subordinating conjunction que, there is a switch into English. Now we have to ask ourselves, why is all this important? In production, fluent code switchers generally exhibit no disfluencies of any kind when switching, no matter the point of the sentence. However, during comprehension, code switchers generally report having little difficulty comprehending these switches across a variety of contexts as well. Now we have to ask ourselves, why is this in any way significant? There is evidence that shows that speakers of any kind, including fluent code switchers, have the ability to anticipate what they're going to say next. They're forming the sentence as they're speaking it, as it's coming out of their mouth. So it stands to reason that the code switcher would then be able to plan or anticipate where they're going to place the switch in the sentence. However, the listener has no such luxury and must respond to the code switch immediately as soon as it takes place, which we would expect that to be a significant cognitive load, but there doesn't seem to be a tremendous amount of evidence for that. The question then becomes, what facilitates this overall ease of comprehension on the part of the listener? Okay. Here I provided an example sentence from my study, which has a typical, it's a typical code switch sentence at the point of the complementizer, which is relatively common. The sentence reads, "Acuerdo empático que," or that the service on Sunday would be short, which translates to the priest emphasized that the service on Sunday would be short. Now, there are interesting studies that show that when we have these two options, as you guys can see, I bolded the English subordinated conjunction que and the Spanish subordinated conjunction que and the English subordinated conjunction that. So we have these two options that the code switcher is faced with. They can choose to either take the Spanish verb, the Spanish subordinated conjunction que, and then an English continuation, or they can elect to use the English subordinated conjunction that, and then proceed into an English continuation. There is a preference that is displayed on the part of monolingual, on the part of code switchers of Spanish, that they not universally prefer, but very strongly prefer this condition of the Spanish verb, the Spanish complementizer, and then the English continuation. So, given the fact that there is this increased frequency of production of the Spanish complementizer, exists a prominent account, more specifically Gennari and McDonald 2008 and 2009, that proposes that sentences and structures that are frequent in production are easier for the comprehension system to process, which stands to reason. So what we have here is we have an increased frequency of production of the Spanish complementizer, and part of what is coming out of the mouth of the code switchers, which means that the comprehension systems of these code switchers is tracking this increased frequency use of the Spanish complementizer and then consequently reducing the subsequent parsing times for this. I modeled my experimental sentences based off of this idea. I would like to point out at this point that I did use an eye tracking study containing code switch sentences at the point of the complementizer. In order to gain a naturalistic reading measure, have not been shown to exhibit code switching behaviors. As you can see, I've drawn two verbs from my study, admitir and empatizar, which respectively mean to admit and to emphasize in Spanish, and exposed my participants to sentences that had the Spanish verb, the Spanish complementizer, and then an English continuation, as well as the Spanish verb, the English complementizer, and then English continuation. Now, based off the exposure-based theories of language, which link the reduced parsing times to this increased speech production of the Spanish complementizer, I would expect from my code switching population that any condition with a Spanish verb, a Spanish complementizer, and an English continuation would exhibit a lower parsing time. It would be easier, we can say, for them to process. However, we would anticipate that a Spanish verb, English complementizer, and an English continuation condition would be slightly more difficult, maybe take a little bit of extra time. For my non-switchers, which I ran in Granada, Spain, and I'll be presenting preliminary findings on them shortly, since they do not code switch, since they're not accustomed to having to cognitively process going back and forth between English and Spanish, I would expect that any kind of switch at any point in the sentence would require a bit more of a cognitive load, which is understandable. So once again, my methodology. I have already run 36 Spanish-English bilinguals in Granada of high proficiency that do not code switch. I'm currently in the process of running 25 Spanish-English bilinguals here at the Pennsylvania State University who are known to exhibit code switching behaviors. And like I've already said, my participants read sentences containing these Spanish verbs and they switch from Spanish into English at the point of the complementizer that or que, as well as various filler sentences in either monolingual English or monolingual Spanish. I would like to present some preliminary results on the Granada bilinguals. If you recall, since they do not code switch, we would expect that they would see about equivalent difficulty across whatever condition I would present them with, and fortunately that is what we found. As you can see, the green bars represent sentences that contain the Spanish complementizer and a switch, and the red bars represent those that had an English complementizer and a switch. And as you can see, just looking at both at the gaze duration and the right bounded duration, the times are very, 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 very close, which was very much on line with what I was expecting. And ultimately, I would like to acknowledge the following people, as well as one person I forgot to put on this slide, and I apologize for that. I would like to thank Professor Julie Duces for her extensive help and guidance. I would like to also thank the Center of Language Science here at Penn State, funding from the National Science Foundation, Pire Grant, Pire Undergraduate Committee, Dr. Teresa Bajo in the center where I conducted my research, and Alvaro, Lauren, Caitlin, and as well as Sharon Elder for their extensive cooperation, help, and guidance and patience throughout the entire process.
So the next speaker is Brennan Tomaszuk, who went to Bangor, Wales in the UK.
Hello everyone, thanks for coming. My name is Brennan Tomaszuk, and as Dr. Van Elber said, I did my research in Bangor, Wales, and the title of my talk is Does Language Modulate Color Perception in Greek-English Bilinguals? So first a little bit of background. Language affecting thought has been studied in a number of different ways, namely spatial awareness, time, and color perception. But today we're going to focus on color perception. An example of this is that color terms vary from language to language. So in Russian, for example, while they would have two separate color terms for what an English speaker would call blue. So while we would call that entire spectrum light blue to dark blue, the Russian speaker would say that the light blues are more Golemboy and the right blues are city, which means that they categorize these entirely differently than we do. And in another study that looked at Greek English that looked at Greek speakers, Greeks have the same blue distinction. Study also to understand whether native Greek speakers would perceive a switch between these two colors more saliently than a native English speaker. So how they did this was an oddball paradigm, and they used an oddball paradigm and ERPs, which Dan mentioned earlier, to measure a switch. So, for example, in block 1, when shown light blue, light blue, light blue, dark blue, when they reach the deviant, the dark blue, a visual mismatch negativity component of ERPs is elicited, which is used to index a sensitivity to a switch. So theoretically, in this study, they should show a more salient switch between the blues than the greens, which has only one color term in both English and Greek. And what they found that this was the case. If you look here on the right, you'll see that the native Greek speakers showed a bigger difference between the standard and the deviant blues in this waveform, whereas the native English than the greens, whereas the native English speakers showed relatively no difference between the two color switches. So what we sought to understand was, of course, do color terms influence color perception, but in particular, can an orthographic or linguistic context affect this in Greek-English bilinguals? So theoretically, if a Greek-English bilingual is framed in a linguistic or orthographic context, then within participant, you should be able to see a difference in waveforms. So in this Greek plot, you should see it should reflect Thudiel's study in that the blue difference is bigger than the green difference, but in an English block or English context, there should be, relatively speaking, no difference at all. Now, the way we did this was by making two significant changes to the original stimuli that Thudiel used. The first is that the color was moved from the foveal vision to the peripheral vision, which allowed for us to add an orthographic context, namely the letters in the center of the screen. So in the Greek block, they were looking at and processing Greek letters while the colors were entering through the periphery. But in an English block, they were doing the same thing, but with English letters. A little bit more background on the participants. We had 12 Greek-English bilinguals, and they were extremely proficient in both languages, which means that there certainly were no deficits in any of their abilities to read and process these letter differences. So what did we find? The first main effect was that there was indeed a visual mismatch negativity, which means that even though these colors were in their periphery, they were processing the difference when you switched from either light blue to dark blue to light blue, etc. Interestingly, though, we did not find any difference between the greens and the blues or the orthographic context. So not only did we did not find interaction between the color and deviancy, as would be expected if language affected perception, but we also didn't see a difference between the greens and the blues in consistency with the 2009 study, which raises a few interesting questions. So the basic VMMN was indeed found, which means that they were processing a switch between colors. But since there was no difference between the blues and the greens, or the language context, it raises two interesting questions. The first is that perhaps this language context was not strong enough. Simply viewing letters in a series is not a strong enough recruitment of the language pathways in your brain. Additionally, it calls into question the role of attention in this effect. So is the fact that in the original study there was color in your foveal vision as opposed to peripheral affect the results? So in order to look at this, we designed two follow-up studies to be done here at State College with Russian-English bilinguals. As I mentioned earlier, Russian has the same blue breakdown. So the study is essentially the same, except for that in this first part, we will use words instead of letters to create a more strong context in which they need to process the language. And in the second study, we'll be doing the same thing, except bringing the colors back into the foveal vision. That way we can understand how this attention and language context can truly be modified to understand how language affects perception. So a big thank you to, of course, all of the Pire team, my advisors here, and everyone that helped me in the data analysis and the data preparation.
Thank you. May I invite all the Pire students to come here? And may I invite you to ask questions?
Just turn it off.
So if you have questions, go ahead.
Well, on that last presentation, I'm wondering if the color of blue, how are we sure that that lighter blue that the Greeks distinguish is the blue that they do distinguish? Because it's not just a matter of lightness. There's hue. And like the Greek flag would be the one term, and the darker blue would be the other term. So, I mean, how do you guys control the quality of the blueness?
I can address that. So, so in addition to the study, the ERP study that I ran, I had them look at that exact spectrum and decide where the line would be between, in that case, Chalazion and Glay for Greek, but also for Sinian Goloboy in Russian. So pretty much everyone believes that in this exact distinction between lightness. So it may not be strictly the lightness, but this lightness did cause there to be two separate color tones. They were certainly separated, if that answers your question.
Yeah, but there you asked them, right, where you distinguish, so they were acute to making the distinction, whereas, see what I'm saying? So anyway, that might be something to fill in.
Angela?
Yeah. So, Brendan, I think you're going to get more questions on just a recency effect. But I was wondering, so when they were doing this, was it the same procedure as the Terry 2009 where they were just asked to make the mismatch kind of judgment, or were they not doing anything? Were they just doing?
Yeah, they had a distractor task. So in the original tutorial, they weren't looking for colors at all. They were looking for shapes. And in my test, they were looking for uppercase letters. So they shouldn't have been processing. Well, they're processing the colors, but strictly unconsciously.
So actually, that was part of my question was when you did the follow-up, I was wondering if maybe it might help them or help you to have the linguistic context be more important by having them maybe have them recall one of the words later on as part of your distractor task, like testing their memory for the words, and that way it would kind of be more of a linguistic task. So just something for that.
Absolutely.
I have a question about the notional number study. So I was thinking about your example of bread and butter. And bread and butter is a phrase that happens very often in English. But for example, in Spanish, pan y mantequilla are not things that we say together. And so I wondered how it is that you control for notional number across languages, because it may not necessarily be the case, first of all, that languages use conjunctions, so they use and. So in some languages they may say coffee with milk instead of coffee and milk. So there may be some differences in syntax, but also more than that, just difference in the co-occurrence of words that might make them notionally singular, notionally plural. So I was wondering if you were able to think about that and how it is that you might have controlled it with the English and Dutch.
We actually, the stimuli that I used were the exact same stimuli from the Lorimer study that was just in Dutch. And they originally got notionality ratings from Dutch people, just saying, same notionality ratings from English modeling. So we have the two differences. The results that I have just factored in the notionality ratings from English. So we're going to factor in the Dutch notionality ratings from the original study later and see how that comes into play, like the differences between the two.
Thank you.
Other questions?
I had a question for Ben really quickly. I was just wondering, in the verbs that you chose in your stimuli, do you have any idea for what the verb bias might be for them? Because some verbs suggest for object, or select for objects, some for complementizers and regular, they have them right. If maybe there could be an effect.
Absolutely, that was a part of the driver. Mental stimuli were divided right down the middle between sentential complement bias verbs, like admitiative we had up there, and direct object bias verbs such as pettifat. So I did manipulate the sentences in relation to the verb bias and have accounts of, based on a study done by Julie in 2010, the frequency with which they're assigned to different rules.
Yeah.
This is for Kelsey. You did the aspiration in Granada. Now you didn't find any differences in F2, which is fine and everything. Have you thought about looking at center of gravity versus the duration of the fricative? It's been found, Danny Erica did some work where there's differences depending on whether they delete, aspirate, or fully realize the S between the center of gravity of the vowel and the duration of the fricative.
I didn't look that, but I'm definitely looking into more things to work on next semester that could help this and analyzing more data and going and testing classroom learners and seeing if they can pick up any lapsing as well, or if it's just emotion.
We talk about this constantly, but I think it's also interesting to say, can you tell us about what the impression of this aspiration is from the perspective of the people in Granada that you talked to?
The what? I'm sorry.
The people in Granada, what is their impression of what they do?
It was funny because when I was presenting this in the lab, they were all like, well, I don't do that. Okay. I'm in your lab, so I'm going to agree. But it's definitely from, they don't believe that they do it, even though I have the data to back it up that they do. And it's also a thought that if they do it, they are lower class than Northern Spain speakers. So if they try to believe that they don't, I'm not sure.
So I have a question for all of you. So Mizuki, Dan, and Brittany, you all found that when bilingual speakers are immersed in their second language, they sort of start losing their first language. Well, you've had the very same experience. So did you subjectively experience the very same thing? Or are we just hunting an experimental artifact?
I definitely say the effects are real. I mean, I've studied French for 8 years, and so it's my first time being from Spain. And just the feeling of like when you go to another country, it's kind of like you've got like this noise in your head that you kind of can't get out. And eventually, I mean, having probably spend more time, like the noise eventually makes more and more sense as you kind of believe it as more a real language.
Other people have the same experiences? Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, kind of going off that too, like right when you got there, it was really hard to tell like if people were saying a sentence or if it was just kind of like, it kind of just seemed like everything was like a big run-on sentence. And then after being there for like a longer period of time, you kind of started to realize like people just spoke really fastly and they were omitting things that I thought were supposed to be in Spanish. So it was just definitely a change, and over time, like we definitely did get used to it. So it kind of goes with like, but we found that the people who were there for shorter periods of time kind of had a heart, like more inhibition to their L1, and I think this is probably one of the reasons. It's just it takes a lot to get used to the way people are speaking and understand really what's going on.
I would absolutely agree that there's definitely effects of immersion. I got a particular amount of exposure because I'm a Spanish major, so I obviously had some exposure to it before I went abroad, but I also worked only with native speakers of Spanish and who were also highly proficient in English. So I got an incredible amount of exposure to the Andaluz
that whole accent bit, which for the first 3 weeks was a nightmare to try to understand, but after kind of the noise, as Dan put it, kind of just turned into words, it was very, very nice. But what I mostly found is that it really actually did play a little bit of havoc with some less skilled people in English as I started getting more comfortable trying to talk in Spanish with people. I would look at a stove and call it a sink, and it was just a mess. And while I would definitely say that my Spanish skills have augmented, no offense, Alvaro, but my intervocalic consonants are a disaster. That definitely rewired my brain a little bit.
So yeah, I mean, it's actually interesting for me because I was really interested in this to begin with as a simultaneous bilingual. So I've never actually had this experience immersed in my second language. And every summer since I was 4 years old, I would go back to Japan, and I already find that when I'm in Japan, I can't speak English for my life. But when I'm in America for an extended amount of time, I can't, Japanese words just don't come out. And it was interesting actually doing this study in the summer. I had to do the first bit of instructions in English, and I had the hardest time doing this throughout the entire few months that I was there. So yeah, this is actually really close to home for me.
So I have another question. A year ago, around this time, you were all thinking about the project and writing the very first drafts of your proposal. So can you say a little bit more about what happened since a year from now? So what have you heard in last year? You prepare yourself to hear.
I suppose I can comment on that. So certainly, I think one thing would be to note that you have to be very dynamic and flexible when working with a research project, especially when you're trying to collaborate with someone in a different time zone. So you really need to be able to work to understand the literature, but also understand how the project fits in both labs and both environments to make it truly worthwhile to work all around.
Yeah, going off of my experience, I honestly, you would never be able to predict that I'd be standing here giving a presentation. I don't think I even knew a lot of these questions the year before. And it's just really interesting how in a research environment, you just kind of have to solve the problems that are presented in front of you, and you try to predict the best you can, but the day goes on and you just have to take the cards that you're given.
I mean, I guess with me, it's been a lot of personal growth than learning all of this stuff. It's just, last year I would not have been able to talk about this, and I think going through all this has helped me figure out what I want to do in the future and figure out exactly how I can speak about this kind of stuff and how to manage my time so that I can get all of this done and do it well.
I think the same as Leah, and actually another thing to add to that too with the personal growth is that you spend time here as a research assistant, and it's one thing coding data for someone or helping translate stimuli or whatever you're being put to do, but when you have to manage your own experiment, it's things get crazy. Things go wrong, things break, you don't know what to do, you're calling and emailing people left and right, and it's a completely different kind of situation, and you just completely see a different side of lab life, and for me it's been an eye-opening kind of experience for that.
I think everybody kind of touched upon exactly what I was going to say, but another thing is last year when I started coming to the CLS speakers on Friday, I'm not from a linguistic background at all, so the first one I went to, I was like, what did they just say? And just how much knowledge I can pick up each week from coming to the speakers, so that's been a really interesting experience. And then again, just the personal growth abroad, really realizing my independence and not knowing the language and finding my way around, and my first time taking public transportation and stuff like that other than the cata bus. So it was just a really unique experience for personal growth.
started out, I was kind of reading a lot of papers and trying to figure out what I found really interesting. And so once I figured out like what I wanted to look at, it was interesting because I was able to actually kind of develop an idea and then figure out from there where I wanted to go. And I never really expected a year from now to have like results from like an idea that I had a year ago. So, and then with the personal growth kind of thing, it was really interesting because you had to really learn how to be lost in a place and be comfortable being lost and being comfortable trying to figure out how to communicate with people when you don't really speak the language. So, yeah.
I think it's interesting for me because I never expected to like learning about Spanish as much as I have come to like learning about Spanish. I went through school learning it and throwing it to the side. But after doing this, I have a real interest in immersion and bilinguals and all that's come with it. And through self-growth, it's really given me a lot of confidence to be able to stand up and talk and know I can go to another country and do something like this and succeed at it.
Well, considering that a number of things I'm touched on at this point, I guess one of the biggest things that I realized while working in Granada, it was a slightly different experience for me because I just got very lucky and I had the entire eye tracking chamber to myself for the duration of the summer, which is wonderful in a lot of ways because I could literally just book participants whenever I wanted. But that kind of led to this dichotomy that I had to learn how to address of being able to independently handle all these problems whenever Pire wants to crash, which is more often than not. Whenever one of your participants walks in a half hour late when you have a tight 12-hour scheduled in, and just being able to generally run things on your own, but also the importance of realizing, okay, I am doing my own thing, but at the end of the day, I'm definitely an undergrad. So Julie, please help. Caitlin Mikowski, please help. Just being able to embrace the fact that you have to take on an incredible amount of personal growth, both academically and personally, but also that there's a network of people around you, which fortunately we have here, that is definitely ready. They're ready to step in case just Pire just not good.
Yeah. So basically everything that they said, and also, well, for my situation, I didn't have a research lab to go to. So I kind of started out here assuming that those sound attenuated chambers were like the norm. But then I went to Kobe and then found out that I had to reserve classrooms and then just have a whole classroom to myself and this one participant so that we could run on a laptop computer, which also crashed often. So yeah, that was kind of like an adjustment to make, especially because for the people here, I would leave them in their chamber by themselves and have let them have their own piece of doing this task. But then for Japan group, I had to sit there with them, and yeah, I kind of thought that was interesting.
Well, I think I speak on behalf of the entire audience that we're all very impressed by the work that you've been presenting this morning. Please join me in thanking